Welcome to the History Maps podcast. We are going straight into a comprehensive deep dive on the British colonization of the Americas.
Which is part of our History of the Americas series.
Right, and when you look at a map of the hemisphere today, you see these clean borders and established nations. But we are setting those aside for this.
Yeah, completely. Because today we are tracing how this incredibly fragile, uncertain enterprise, which was born out of, frankly, geopolitical desperation and intense rivalries, evolved into a global empire.
And a shocking amount of trial and error, too. I mean, we are looking at a story that begins not with these grand democratic ideals that we always hear about, but with state-sponsored piracy rings.
In a brutal administrative laboratory in Ireland.
Yeah, and even an accidental shipwreck in a hurricane that inadvertently proved to London that an overseas empire could, actually turn a profit.
The trajectory is quite profound when you view it from the starting line rather than the finish line. We have a really expansive timeline to cover here.
From those initial freezing 16th century expeditions all the way through the labyrinthine legal legacies of 20th century decolonization.
Right. It is a narrative of economic engines, demographic shifts, and these invisible lines of citizenship that continue to shape the lives of millions of people across the Americas right now.
So to understand how the English built their American empire, you really have to look at their initial motivations. And the reality is England had a notoriously late start.
Very late. By the time the English seriously looked across the Atlantic, Spain and Portugal had been dominating early colonization for decades.
Decades after 1492. I mean, King Henry VII did send John Cabot in 1497 to explore the North American coast, but
the momentum just completely stalled.
yeah, it evaporated.
Yeah.
And you have to put yourself in the shoes of a Tudor monarch. Why pour money into wooden ships to map freezing coastlines when the Spanish are pulling literal galleons of silver out of Central and South America?
Right. The economic reality really dictated that entire first century of European exploration because the Spanish model set this highly lucrative standard.
They encountered complex, centralized empires.
Exactly. Precisely. They conquered them, and they commandeered the existing systems of tribute and labor to extract vast mineral wealth.
But when English explorers arrive on the coast of North America, they didn't find that. They found dense forests, harsh winters, and decentralized indigenous societies.
Yeah, there was no gold waiting to be seized. So consequently, for much of the 16th century, the English diverted their focus toward finding a northwest passage.
You wanted a shortcut.
A shortcut to the established markets of Asia. You have explorers like Martin Frobisher and Henry Hudson driving their wooden ships into the Arctic ice.
Enduring scurvy and starvation.
Yeah, just trying to force a route through to the Pacific. And of course, they found no viable path.
But instead of gold or shortcut to Asia, they found cod.
Which is much less glamorous.
Much less. But Europeans began establishing these seasonal fisheries in the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. It was a practical trade, exchanging metal tools and glass with indigenous peoples for food and fur.
But that shifts, right? It shifts from passive fishing to active maritime dominance around 1585.
Right. Bernard Drake launches an expedition to Newfoundland and completely cripples the Spanish and Portuguese fishing fleets.
And those fleets never recovered. That action cleared the North Atlantic waters for English expansion. You can see the strategy pivoting.
From just trying to find wealth to actively depriving their rivals of it.
Yeah. And that military action by Bernard Drake highlights a really crucial geopolitical shift. Protestant England was locked in an existential and religious war with Catholic Spain.
To survive, the English recognized they had to weaken Spain's economic engine. They couldn't match Spanish land armies in Europe.
But they could harass their supply lines. And this ushers in the era of the privateer. You have figures like Francis Drake and Humphrey Gilbert who are operating as essentially state-sanctioned pirates.
The crown gave them letters of marque.
Right, which legally authorized them to attack and plunder Spanish treasure ships in the Caribbean and the Atlantic.
And Humphrey Gilbert actually proposed colonizing North America specifically to create military bases for this.
The logic was purely strategic. If you have a fortified harbor on the American coast, your privateers can repair their ships and restock supplies without having to sail all the way back to England.
So if you were an investor in London, you viewed the early American colonies essentially as pirate coves.
That's a fair way to put it, yeah.
You weren't trying to build a new society. You were funding a forward operating base. But there is another foundational element here that serves as a dark blueprint for everything that follows.
The Irish blueprint.
Yes. Before the English tried to colonize America, they colonized Ireland. The English colonization of America was directly modeled on the English colonization of Ireland.
Specifically the Munster Plantation. It served as a laboratory for empire. It was England's first comprehensive attempt at overseas colonization.
And they used it to develop specific tactics, right?
Right, tactics of subjugation, land confiscation, and population control. Many of the early colonial leaders in North America belonged to a group known as the West Countrymen.
And they built their careers and their fortunes colonizing Ireland.
They did. They developed a legal and cultural framework that justified taking land from people they deemed uncivilized.
Which is a mindset they brought right across the Atlantic.
Mhm.
I mean, when Sir Walter Raleigh landed in Virginia, the sources show he explicitly compared the Native Americans to the wild Irish.
The intellectual leap had already been made?
So you can view the Munster Plantation as a rough draft for American colonization. The English did not invent a new system when they crossed the Atlantic. They exported a prepackaged system of subjugation directly to the Americas.
So that framing is highly accurate. They applied a learned framework of population control and land extraction to a completely new continent. But the transition was not seamless.
No, not at all. Look at Roanoke. Walter Raleigh sponsored an expedition of 500 men to establish the Roanoke colony in 1584.
And because their primary focus was on establishing a military and privateering outpost rather than, achieving agricultural self-sufficiency,
They were profoundly unprepared.
profoundly unprepared for the environmental realities of the North American coast. They alienated the local Algonquian populations upon whom they relied for food.
And by 1590, when a resupply ship finally arrived, the colonists had vanished.
Right. And while the enduring theory is that they integrated with local Native American tribes to survive, the failure of Roanoke proved a harsh administrative lesson to London.
Which was that military outposts alone could not sustain an empire.
You can't fund an empire purely on piracy forever.
The Roanoke disaster proved that stealing Spanish gold wasn't a long-term business model. The crown needed a self-sustaining revenue engine.
But they absolutely did not want to foot the bill for another failure.
Right, so they outsourced it. They shifted their strategy to corporate charters, handing the financial risk over to private joint stock companies.
It's quite calculated. If it fails, the investors lose their shirts. If it succeeds, the crown gets a cut of the trade.
And this corporate mechanism leads us directly to the founding of Jamestown in 1607.
Established under King James I by the Virginia Company of London, and the conditions on the ground were brutal.
They chose a site on a tidal estuary.
Right, which was highly defensible against Spanish ships, but it was an ecological nightmare. The water was brackish, mosquito-borne diseases like malaria and dysentery were rampant.
And the colonists, many of whom were, gentlemen unaccustomed to manual labor, just struggled to grow food.
Out of the 1,700 colonists transported to Jamestown in its early years, only 351 were still alive by 1617.
The mortality rate is indicative of an enterprise operating on the absolute brink of collapse. I mean, an 80% death rate over a decade.
It paints a picture of absolute desperation. The colony was entirely dependent on frequent, tense negotiations and outright conflict with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy.
Jamestown only survived because of a sudden economic boom brought about by a single, highly addictive cash crop. Tobacco. John Rolfe introduced a sweeter strain of Orinoco tobacco that became wildly popular in London.
It completely changed the financial trajectory of the colony.
It did. But while Jamestown was struggling through starvation and disease, another English settlement was being founded completely by accident. And this is one of those narrative vignettes that just alters the course of history.
The wreck of the Sea Venture.
Right, in 1609.
The Sea Venture was the flagship of the Virginia Company. It was commanded by Admiral George Somers and carrying the newly appointed lieutenant governor for Jamestown, Thomas Gates.
They were leading a flotilla to resupply the desperate Jamestown colony.
And en route, they sailed directly into a hurricane.
After days of fighting the storm, with the ship taking on water faster than it could be pumped out, they spotted land.
Somers deliberately drove the Sea Venture onto the reefs of Bermuda to prevent the ship from sinking in deep water.
And this uninhabited archipelago was initially named Virginiola, right, to tightly associate it with the Virginia Company.
Though it eventually became known as the Somers Isles.
Imagine surviving a hurricane, crashing onto a reef, and wading ashore to an unknown island. All 150 passengers and crew survive.
It's quite a story. They find an island rich in wild pigs, which had been left behind by earlier Spanish explorers, and dense forests of native cedar.
And over the next 10 months, they actually build two entirely new ships, the Deliverance and the Patience, using the wreckage of the Sea Venture and the local cedar.
Most of the survivors sail on to Jamestown the following year, only to find the Virginia colony in the middle of its devastating starving time,
But a few men stay behind in Bermuda to maintain a physical claim to the islands.
which ensures Bermuda remains settled. By 1612, they officially establish St. George's Town.
This is a critical milestone. St. George's Town was the first actual continuous town established by the English in the New World. At that point, Jamestown was still basically just a rudimentary military fort
And from that moment, Bermuda's trajectory diverges sharply from Jamestown's.
because of the environment.
Yes, because of its mild climate and the lack of indigenous hostile populations, Bermuda quickly became more populous, self-sufficient, and prosperous than the mainland colony.
They initially pioneered tobacco cultivation there, didn't they?
They did, actually beating Virginia to the London market. However, the geographic constraints of a small island soon became apparent.
You just run out of land.
Precisely. As Virginia's tobacco agriculture rapidly expanded in the 1620s, fueled by vast tracts of land, the global price of tobacco plummeted.
And the absentee shareholders in London demanded that Bermudians grow more tobacco to make up for the lower prices.
But the local Bermudians realized that intensive tobacco cultivation was rapidly depleting their shallow soil. It was ruining their internal economy.
So the Bermudians pivot. They realize they can't compete in agriculture, but they have world-class cedar and a deep knowledge of the Atlantic winds.
So they shift to maritime logistics.
They start building these incredibly fast, highly maneuverable Bermuda sloops.
Right. These ships featured a raked mast and triangular sails. It allowed them to sail closer to the wind than traditional square-rigged European vessels.
The Bermudians took control of the intercolonial trade network. They became the merchants, the smugglers, and the sailors connecting the Caribbean, the American mainland, and Europe.
This pivot really highlights the high degree of adaptability required for colonial survival. While the mainland focused on land-intensive agriculture, Bermuda found its economic niche in logistical dominance.
However, if we examine the broader balance sheet of the English economy during this period, the most lucrative and consequential shift was happening further south.
Right, the Caribbean.
And I want to push back on the traditional narrative that many of us are taught. We learned so much about mainland North America, about the struggles in Virginia and the religious settlements in New England.
It feels like the mainland was the undeniable center of the British universe.
Exactly. But the historical ledger tells a completely different story. After colonial failures in Guyana in 1604 and Grenada in 1609, King Charles I granted a charter for Barbados in 1627.
The colonists there tried growing tobacco, failed to compete with Virginia, and then transitioned to sugar.
Just how much more valuable were these Caribbean sugar islands to the crown compared to the sprawling mainland colonies?
The economic disparity is difficult to overstate. The English government consistently viewed the Caribbean islands as the crown jewels of their emerging empire.
Far outvaluing New England or the Chesapeake region.
Oh, absolutely. Sugar was a luxury commodity in Europe, and the demand was insatiable. But refining sugar from cane is an incredibly capital-intensive and labor-intensive industrial process.
It requires crushing mills, boiling houses,
And an enormous workforce operating under punishing, dangerous conditions in a tropical climate. You cannot run a profitable sugar plantation relying on European indentured servants.
because they succumb to yellow fever and malaria.
Right. This shift to a sugar economy necessitated a horrific transition in human labor.
The Caribbean colonies adopted the brutal plantation system previously pioneered by the Portuguese in Brazil.
And this economic demand directly fueled the rise of the Royal African Company, which held a monopoly on English trade with West Africa.
We are talking about the industrial-scale capture and transportation of millions of enslaved Africans. Until the abolition of its slave trade in 1807, Britain was responsible for transporting roughly 3.5 million enslaved people to the Americas.
That number represents approximately 1/3 of all enslaved people transported across the Atlantic during the entire history of the trade.
And the demographic impact on the Caribbean was swift and absolute.
Yes, the enslaved population soon formed the overwhelming demographic majority in colonies like Barbados, Antigua, and Jamaica.
Which England captured from Spain in 1655.
Right. And to maintain control over a population where the enslaved vastly outnumbered the enslavers, colonial legislatures enacted comprehensive draconian slave codes,
These laws legally classified human beings as chattel property.
establishing a system of violence and coercion to ensure maximum agricultural output. The fundamental economic engine of the British Empire was built directly upon this system of forced labor and resource extraction in the Caribbean and the southern mainland colonies.
So while the South and the Caribbean are chasing immense agricultural wealth through a system of forced labor, a very different type of colonization was taking shape further north,
We see the establishment of New England.
driven not by the pursuit of a cash crop, but by intense religious fervor and the desire to build a specific type of society.
We observe a clear bifurcation in the purpose of English colonization here. In 1620, the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower and established Plymouth Colony.
They were religious separatists, right? They believed the Church of England was beyond reform.
Correct. And they survived their first devastating winter, where half their population perished, only through a strategic alliance with the local Wampanoag tribe.
Who taught them effective agricultural practices for the region's specific soil.
Right.
We all know the traditional Thanksgiving narrative of the Pilgrims. But what is fascinating from an economic and structural perspective is what happens next. In 1629, the Great Puritan Migration begins.
John Winthrop leads thousands of settlers to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
And they weren't separatists like the Pilgrims, were they?
No, they sought to purify the Church of England from within by establishing a model, strict Calvinist Protestant society in the New World, a city upon a hill.
But theology does not alter geography. New England was relatively cold, and the soil was rocky and infertile compared to the southern colonies.
They could not rely on cash crops like tobacco or sugar.
So their theology of rigorous hard work was instantly redirected into deepwater fishing, timber extraction, and building out a robust maritime trade network.
The environmental constraints of New England fostered a highly diversified mercantile economy. They built ships, harvested cod, and traded aggressively.
Often supplying the Caribbean sugar plantations with the timber and salted fish necessary to keep the enslaved populations fed and the sugar mills operating.
It was all connected. And as the New England population expanded, the initial alliances with indigenous populations deteriorated into brutal conflicts over land.
The expansion of English settlement into the Connecticut River Valley directly precipitated the Pequot War.
Resulting in the near annihilation of the Pequot people. We also see internal ideological fracturing within the Puritan communities themselves.
Right, figures like Roger Williams. He advocated for religious toleration and fair dealings with Native Americans, and he was expelled from Massachusetts.
Williams went on to found Rhode Island, establishing it as a colony with a formal separation of church and state.
So while New England was consolidating its religious communities and building a merchant fleet, and the southern colonies were entrenched in plantation agriculture, a major geopolitical vulnerability existed right in the middle of the eastern seaboard.
The Dutch.
The Dutch. They had established the colony of New Netherland, with its capital at New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island.
They controlled the vital Hudson and Delaware rivers, which were the logistical superhighways into the North American interior for the lucrative fur trade.
But in 1664, an English military expedition, led by Richard Nicolls, sails into the harbor and captures New Netherland for the Duke of York.
Who would later become King James II.
Now, the Dutch did briefly regain portions of the territory during the Third Anglo-Dutch War.
But the geopolitical writing was on the wall. They ultimately surrendered their claim entirely in the 1674 Treaty of Westminster.
This formal concession effectively ended the Dutch colonial presence in North America. The English carved the vast territory up into the colonies of New York and New Jersey.
Which is a huge structural shift.
If you look at the capture of New Netherland through a modern lens, it operates exactly like a hostile corporate takeover.
How so?
Well, the British recognized that the Dutch were their primary commercial rival. By absorbing the Dutch operations, Britain didn't just gain real estate, they swallowed their most competent shipping competitor.
Ah, I see. They locked down the entire logistics network of the eastern seaboard.
Granting themselves a contiguous, unbroken monopoly from New England all the way down to the Carolinas.
And like any hostile takeover, the real prize is market consolidation. It allowed the English crown to enforce its trade regulations across a unified coastline without a foreign power sitting in the middle offering better prices or smuggling routes.
And shortly after this consolidation, the map of the Middle Colonies changes again. In 1681, King Charles II grants a vast tract of land to William Penn.
To settle a debt owed to Penn's father. Penn was a devout Quaker, a religious group heavily persecuted in England.
He sought to create a holy experiment in Pennsylvania, a haven of religious toleration and pacifism.
And Penn actively marketed his colony across Europe, offering cheap, fertile land and religious freedom.
This attracted not just Quakers, but enormous numbers of German Protestants, Irish Catholics, and other dissenting groups.
This influx made Philadelphia a thriving cosmopolitan port and drove unprecedented immigration into the region.
So by the late 17th century, you have three distinctly different colonial regions operating under the British flag.
You have New England with its Puritan roots and maritime economy.
You have the middle colonies with their aristocratic land grants, religious pluralism, and deep agricultural ports.
And you have the southern colonies and the Caribbean, entirely structured around plantation economies reliant on enslaved labor.
The divergence is critical to understand. They were all legally English subjects operating under the same monarch, but their day-to-day societies, their economic engines, and their cultural values were fundamentally different.
These deeply ingrained regional identities were established very early on, and the friction between these differing systems would ultimately profoundly influence the political structures of the Americas in the centuries to come.
But before these distinct regions clashed with each other, they underwent a period of intense economic growth and imperial consolidation.
That set them on a direct collision course with the French Empire.
Which brings us to a sequence of events that ultimately severs the 13 colonies from the British Empire entirely. It starts with a shift in management back in London.
Right. After the Glorious Revolution in 1688, when William and Mary deposed the Catholic James II, the Crown and Parliament began tightening their administrative grip on the American colonies.
Prior to the Glorious Revolution, the colonies had enjoyed a period of relative autonomy.
Sometimes referred to as salutary neglect. But as the empire grew more valuable, London sought tighter control. They began rigorously enforcing mercantilist policies, most notably the Navigation Acts.
The underlying economic philosophy of mercantilism is that global wealth is finite, and colonies exist solely to enrich the mother country.
Yes. The Navigation Acts mandated that valuable colonial goods could only be shipped to England, and they had to be transported on English ships with English crews.
Imagine the frustration if you are a merchant in Boston or Philadelphia. You have timber or tobacco that you want to sell to French or Dutch buyers who are offering a premium price.
Under the Navigation Acts, you literally are not allowed to make that direct sale.
You have to ship your cargo to England first, pay a tariff, and let an English middleman take a cut before the product goes anywhere else.
You can see how this system artificially strangled colonial wealth while enriching the merchants back in London.
Despite the constraints of the Navigation Acts, though, the colonies experienced an immense demographic and economic explosion.
The availability of land, high birth rates, and continuous immigration pushed the population of the 13 colonies to roughly 1.5 million by 1750.
They were no longer fragile outposts clinging to the coast. They were fully integrated components of a sophisticated global trading network.
They exported timber, tobacco, and agricultural foodstuffs, exchanging them for Asian tea, British manufactured goods, and West Indian sugar.
By 1770, the economic output of the 13 colonies constituted nearly 40% of the gross domestic product of the entire British Empire.
40% of the empire's GDP is a staggering figure. They were an absolute economic powerhouse.
And as the colonial population grew, settlers continuously pushed westward, searching for fresh agricultural land. They crossed the Appalachian Mountains and moved into the Ohio River Valley.
But this westward expansion put them on a direct, unavoidable collision course with the French.
France had established a vast colonial footprint stretching from Quebec down through the Mississippi River to New Orleans.
Supported by an extensive network of indigenous alliances and fur trading posts.
The imperial friction over the Ohio River Valley triggers the French and Indian War, which lasts from 1754 to 1763.
The conflict actually ignites when a young Virginian militia officer named George Washington leads a force into the contested region and clashes with French troops near the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers.
What starts as a frontier skirmish rapidly escalates into a global transoceanic war between Britain and France, fought across multiple continents.
In London, Prime Minister William Pitt recognizes the strategic necessity of defeating France in North America. He pours unprecedented financial resources into the military effort.
sending thousands of British regulars across the Atlantic to fight alongside colonial militias.
And the combined forces ultimately conquer major French strongholds, including Quebec and Montreal.
The war ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which is a geopolitical earthquake.
France formally surrenders almost all of its colonial territory east of the Mississippi River to Britain, and Spain cedes Florida to Britain.
In a single treaty, the British Empire achieves total, uncontested dominance over eastern North America. But that military victory came at an immense financial cost.
The British government emerged from the war facing a severe sovereign debt crisis. To pay down the debt incurred by defending the American colonies, Parliament decides that the colonists must begin contributing to their own defense and administration.
They begin passing a series of direct taxes, starting with the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765.
Simultaneously, to avoid further costly military conflicts with indigenous nations over land, the Crown issues the Royal Proclamation of 1763.
This proclamation legally restricted colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains.
Angering colonists who felt they had just fought a war specifically to gain access to that territory.
These actions fundamentally altered the psychological relationship between the colonies and the metropole. The British perspective is pragmatic. We went into massive debt to protect you from the French. It is only fair that you pay a fraction of the tax burden borne by citizens in England.
But the colonists, who were deeply accustomed to a degree of self-rule through their own local assemblies, view taxation by a distant parliament where they hold no seats as an infringement on their rights as English subjects.
They view taxation without representation as tyranny.
Which brings us to a profound question about political radicalization. How do subjects who traded so heavily with the mother country and who viewed themselves as proud, equal members of the British Empire radicalize so completely in just a single decade?
The answer lies in a rapid psychological shift. The colonists went from viewing themselves as equal partners in a shared imperial project to feeling like subjugated financial resources being squeezed by a distant bureaucracy.
Furthermore, the total removal of the French military threat from their borders paradoxically removed the colonists' reliance on the British Army for protection.
Without the French looming next door, the presence of British troops in colonial cities suddenly looked less like a protective shield and more like an occupying force deployed to enforce unpopular taxation.
The geopolitical safety provided by the British victory in 1763 essentially enabled the colonial rebellion in 1776.
The tension continually escalates, leading to the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, the formal Declaration of Independence, and the outbreak of the American Revolution.
The colonists secure crucial military and financial alliances with France and Spain, who were eager to weaken their British rival.
The conflict culminates when the British Army is trapped by American and French forces at Yorktown, surrendering in 1781.
And the subsequent Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially severs the 13 colonies from the empire, recognizing the sovereign United States of America.
The loss of the 13 colonies deeply shocked the political and economic establishment in London. They lost their most populous and economically dynamic settler colonies.
It forced the British government to fundamentally rethink its imperial strategy. Historians refer to the era following 1783 as the Second British Empire.
The focus shifted away from the lost American territories and toward trade in Asia, specifically India, and the consolidation of its remaining North American territories.
And this transition directly leads to the making of modern Canada.
During and immediately after the American Revolution, a vast number of colonists who remained loyal to the Crown, between 40,000 and 100,000 people, fled the newly independent United States.
These loyalists migrated northward into the remaining British territories.
This sudden, enormous demographic influx of English speakers into predominantly French-speaking regions forced the British government to reorganize its northern administration.
They created the colony of New Brunswick in 1784 to accommodate the Loyalists. Then, in 1791, they passed the Constitutional Act,
which divided the Central Territory into Upper Canada, which was predominantly English-speaking and governed by English common law,
and Lower Canada, which retained French civil law and Catholic traditions to diffuse ethnic and linguistic tensions.
The British were determined to assert strong imperial authority over these northern colonies. They wanted to strictly avoid the sort of decentralized, popular control of government that they believed had directly caused the American Revolution.
However, the geographic and political tensions between the British Empire and the expanding United States did not end with the 1783 treaty.
No, the friction continued and eventually culminated in the War of 1812.
This conflict was driven by American desires to expand their territory northward, combined with deep anger over the British Royal Navy's practice of impressment.
Forcing American sailors to serve on British warships during the ongoing Napoleonic Wars in Europe.
The British utilized their remaining imperial network to wage the war. They orchestrated a devastating naval blockade of the United States coastline, coordinated heavily from their strategic naval base in Bermuda.
They even launched the Chesapeake Campaign from Bermuda, which successfully captured and burned the public buildings of Washington, D.C.
The War of 1812 is frequently viewed from a military perspective as a stalemate, ending with the 1814 Treaty of Ghent.
which essentially reaffirmed the pre-war borders.
But strategically and psychologically, it was a defining existential moment for British North America.
The successful defense of the Canadian territories by a coalition of British regular troops, local Canadian militias, and crucial Native American allies demonstrated that the United States could not easily annex the northern colonies.
It firmly established that Canada's political future would remain separate from the United States.
There's a profound irony there. By invading Canada in 1812, the United States essentially forced these disparate northern colonies, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, the Maritimes, to forge a unified defensive identity.
By attempting to conquer the territory, the Americans inadvertently guaranteed that Canada would remain a distinct, separate entity forever.
The pressure of an external threat is a powerful unifying force. And while the British were defending their eastern borders against the Americans, they were simultaneously pushing their influence westward across the continent.
The late 18th century saw significant Pacific expansion. In 1789, the Nootka Crisis occurred, where Britain utilized the threat of its superior navy to force Spain to back down from its exclusive territorial claims in the Pacific Northwest.
This diplomatic victory opened the door for extensive naval mapping by explorers like George Vancouver.
And the grueling overland expeditions of fur traders like Alexander Mackenzie and David Thompson, which effectively stretched British North American claims all the way to the shores of the Pacific Ocean.
So during this Second British Empire phase, they are actively consolidating a vast continental landmass in the north. But British imperial strategy was also undergoing a profound ideological shift globally.
Yes, the intellectual framework of empire was changing, influenced heavily by the economic theories of Adam Smith.
Whose seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, was published the same year as the American Declaration of Independence.
Right. British policymakers began to question the old mercantilist system. Smith argued that wealth was generated through free trade and open markets, not the monopolistic hoarding of resources.
Consequently, Britain began to prioritize the expansion of global free trade rather than the expensive administrative burden of strict territorial control.
They developed an unofficial empire, utilizing their vast financial capital and the unmatched power of the Royal Navy to enforce favorable trade agreements, often through gunboat diplomacy, across independent regions like Latin America and the Qing dynasty in China.
This shift toward free trade and changing moral landscapes sets the stage for a massive internal transition back in the Americas.
During the 19th century, Britain was slowly allowing Canada to move towards self-governance.
Following the rebellions of 1837, the British passed the Act of Union in 1840, uniting Upper and Lower Canada.
This long process of political evolution culminated in the British North America Act of 1867, which created the Federated Dominion of Canada.
But while the North was peacefully reorganizing into a self-governing nation, a profound moral and economic upheaval was occurring in the British Caribbean.
The abolition movement, driven by religious groups and human rights campaigners in Britain, gained undeniable political traction.
The moral argument against the barbarity of slavery finally overcame the entrenched economic interests of the West India planter lobby.
Parliament abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. However, the institution of slavery itself remained legal in the colonies for several more decades.
It was not until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 that the institution was dismantled throughout the British Empire.
The economic fallout for the Caribbean sugar colonies was severe and immediate. Their entire economic model, their profitability, was built completely on the continuous exploitation of unpaid, enslaved labor.
Once they had to transition to a wage-based economy, the profit margins collapsed.
And this crisis was exacerbated a decade later by the Sugar Duties Act of 1846.
This act dismantled the old mercantilist protections, ending the preferential tariffs that had guaranteed British Caribbean sugar a monopoly in the UK market.
The colonies were suddenly forced to compete on the open market against sugar produced in places like Cuba and Brazil, where slavery was still widely practiced.
To sustain the agricultural output of the plantations and replace the labor of formerly enslaved people, many of whom chose to leave the brutal conditions of the sugar estates to cultivate their own small plots of land, colonial governments implemented new systems of labor.
Plantations in colonies like Trinidad and British Guiana began importing hundreds of thousands of indentured servants, primarily from India and China.
These laborers signed multi-year contracts under harsh conditions, leading to a profound demographic shift that fundamentally shapes the rich, multicultural fabric of the Caribbean today.
If we move forward to the post-World War II era, we see the final unraveling of the formal empire in the region. The global wave of decolonization accelerates rapidly.
The British government, exhausted and financially depleted by the war, faces intense geopolitical pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union to dismantle its colonial holdings.
Driven by Cold War fears of communist infiltration in impoverished colonies, London seeks to speed up the move toward Caribbean self-governance.
In 1958, they attempt an ambitious political project, uniting their various Caribbean island colonies into a single independent nation called the West Indies Federation.
The intent was to create a politically viable and economically self-sufficient state. However, the Federation was fundamentally fraught from its inception.
The islands were separated by vast stretches of ocean, they had different levels of economic development, and they lacked a strong, unifying federal identity.
The experiment lasted only 4 years, collapsing in 1962.
The West Indies Federation always strikes me as the classic nightmare group project mandated by management. You take a bunch of distinct entities and force them together to save administrative overhead.
But very quickly, Jamaica and Trinidad, the two largest, wealthiest, and most populous members, realized they are carrying all the financial weight for the smaller islands.
They look at the balance sheet, pack up their briefcases, and decide to strike out for independence on their own. Once they leave, the entire structure disintegrates.
The group project analogy captures the inherent economic and political imbalances perfectly. Jamaica and Trinidad felt their own national development was being hindered by subsidizing the broader federation.
However, if we step back and evaluate the broader decolonization process in the British Caribbean, a crucial distinction emerges.
Compared to other European empires of the era, such as the French fighting a devastating bloody war in Algeria, or the Portuguese fighting protracted colonial wars in Angola and Mozambique, the British transition to independence in the Caribbean was achieved through negotiation and constitutional process.
It was economically disruptive, but it largely avoided systemic violence.
That transition to independence across the Americas left an incredibly complex legacy.
And here's where our narrative shifts away from physical geography, forts, and trade routes and moves into the invisible, bureaucratic lines of law.
The formal empire may have unwound, but the legal ties binding the populations of the former colonies to the United Kingdom evolved into a labyrinth of bureaucracy that directly impacted the lives of millions.
To understand the modern legal legacy, we have to understand the historical baseline. For centuries, the legal concept of a British subject was universal across the empire.
Whether you were born in London, Kingston, or Toronto, you owed allegiance to the crown and you were a British subject.
In theory, under common law, any British subject possessed the right to enter, reside, and work freely in the United Kingdom.
Following the trauma of World War II, the British Nationality Act of 1948 was passed, and it formally retained this blanket nationality.
The intention was to maintain a strong, unified Commonwealth by allowing free movement between the UK, its remaining colonies, and the newly independent Commonwealth nations.
But the historical record shows how quickly and aggressively that ideal of free movement was dismantled.
During the 1940s and 50s, the United Kingdom faced severe labor shortages and invited workers from the Caribbean and other colonies to help rebuild the country.
However, this inflow of people of color from the Commonwealth to the UK was met with significant political and racial backlash from domestic populations.
This political pressure led directly to the passage of the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962.
This act fundamentally altered the landscape by restricting the rights of Commonwealth nationals to enter and work in the UK, tying entry to specific employment vouchers.
The 1962 Act was a watershed moment. shifting British policy from open access to restriction, and the legal barriers were rapidly fortified.
The situation escalated with the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1968. This legislation was largely a rapid response to geopolitical events in East Africa.
Where newly independent nations like Kenya were implementing policies that marginalized their ethnic Indian populations.
Many of these individuals held British passports and sought refuge in the UK. The 1968 Act stripped all British subjects who were not born in the United Kingdom, and crucially, who did not have at least one parent or grandparent born in the UK, of the right to freely enter and reside there.
You can see the legal architecture actively sorting citizens based on ancestry, which in practice heavily favored white colonial populations in places like Canada or Australia over non-white populations in the Caribbean or Asia.
This bureaucratic sorting process continues with the Immigration Act of 1971, which formalized the concept of patriality.
It effectively divided citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies into two distinct tiers: those with a close connection to the UK, who retained the right of abode, and those born in the colonies without that ancestral link who were denied the right to live in Britain.
This long process of restriction culminates in the pivotal British Nationality Act of 1981, which took effect in 1983.
The 1981 Act dismantled the centuries-old concept of the universal British subject. It completely restructured citizenship, creating distinct categories.
It reclassified the citizenship of people living in the remaining colonies, places like Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, and the British Virgin Islands.
They were stripped of their full citizenship and reclassified as holding British Dependent Territories citizenship.
Crucially, this new status provided no right of abode anywhere. It was a passport that did not guarantee you the right to live in the country that issued it.
There were specific, politically motivated exceptions made. The inhabitants of Gibraltar retained full rights to maintain their status within the European Economic Community, and the Falkland Islanders were granted full British citizenship shortly after the Falklands War in 1983.
When you dig into the legal philosophy here, it highlights a profound, almost surreal tension. These modern parliamentary acts directly conflicted with the foundational documents of the colonies themselves.
Take Bermuda, for example. Bermuda's original royal charter from 1612 explicitly, legally guaranteed that all colonists and their descendants would possess the rights and liberties of natural subjects born within the realm of England.
How does a modern government in 1981 retroactively nullify a legal promise made under the King's seal nearly 400 years prior?
It comes down to the constitutional bedrock of the British system: parliamentary sovereignty.
In the UK, Parliament is the supreme legal authority. It can pass or repeal any law whatsoever, and crucially, a current parliament cannot be legally bound by the actions of previous parliaments or historical royal decrees.
Therefore, an act passed in 1981 supersedes a charter issued in 1612.
However, while the legal mechanics are clear, the sociological and psychological impact on the colonies was profound and deeply alienating. You had locals in territories like Bermuda holding a British passport that actually restricted their global movement more severely than the passports held by their parents or grandparents.
The widely accepted analysis of the 1981 Act is that it was designed as a preemptive mechanism to prepare for the eventual 1997 handover of Hong Kong to China, legally ensuring that millions of ethnic Chinese British nationals could not migrate en masse to the United Kingdom.
The rules changed again in 2002. The British Overseas Territories Act formally renamed the remaining dependent territories to British Overseas Territories.
The Act removed the most severe bars to residence, allowing citizens of these territories to register as full British citizens and obtain a standard passport with the right of abode.
But the labyrinth of bureaucratic complexity, the differing classes of citizenship, and the historical memory of having rights arbitrarily stripped away remains a lived reality for people in these territories today.
The legal architecture of an empire often proves far more resilient than its physical footprint.
The progression of these immigration and nationality laws demonstrates how the metropole, the center of power, continuously sought to define its boundaries. Long after the era of claiming territory had ended, the state was utilizing the tools of bureaucracy to define its borders demographically and legally.
Deciding who belonged to the nation and who did not. It is a remarkable journey. We started with freezing, scurvy-ridden sailors failing to find a Northwest Passage, moved through the brutal, world-altering economics of sugar plantations and privateering, and ended up navigating the labyrinthine paperwork and passports that define modern borders.
Which leaves you with a final thought to ponder long after we wrap up here.
The physical map of the Americas today, the borders you see on a globe, is just the surface layer. The true lasting remnants of the British colonization aren't just the restored forts, the English place names, or the lines drawn on a map. The real legacy is found in the invisible, deeply complex lines of legal definitions, inherited institutions, and layers of citizenship that still silently dictate the opportunities, the identities, and the global movements of millions of people across the hemisphere today.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.